After a long wait between titles, Fire Emblem Engage has finally arrived, and after beating the game, I have so many opinions on it, both good and less good. So before we dive in, let me state that I will try to keep the majority of this review spoiler-free. However, I do have opinions that are tied to spoilers, so I'm going to include a spoiler section with an advance warning. If you haven't played the game yet, you can watch most of this review without fear of being spoiled. Just keep an ear out for the warning and react appropriately. At the risk of starting with my conclusion and spoiling my entire video, I loved Engage. Mostly. I had a ton of reservations about the game as far back as the early leaks that I covered in an earlier video, and those weren't really eased as the game's release date approached. However, as an overall package, Engage was thankfully a very strong entry, albeit one with some notable flaws. So to start with the good, the gameplay was fantastic. I think that this is the most that I've enjoyed just playing a Fire Emblem game since at least Conquest, if not all the way back to Radiant Dawn. The game was smooth, mechanically interesting, and just really fun to play from start to finish. Despite movement being slightly reduced in Engage, I was surprised by how quick and slick battles felt all the way through. I never really felt dragged down or held back by the lower movement, and the game surprisingly never really suffered for it. Instead, I felt like battles were paced rather well, and I generally found myself in the action more often than not. With a great flow to the battles, I felt like turtling was generally discouraged, and instead, the game tended to keep me on my toes with surprises like bosses moving or well-timed rushes from the enemies. Everything felt really fast and tense, and I always enjoyed the battles throughout the entire game. With my first run on Hard Classic, I felt like the difficulty was set pretty fairly. I didn't often struggle admittedly, but there were some situations that made me think, and even a handful of times when I actually had to use my time crystal for something other than an unlucky crit. While it wasn't overtly difficult, I felt like it was a really reasonable middle difficulty, and I look forward to the challenge that Maddening will bring when I take that on. Taking a page out of the GBA Games' book in the best possible way, the combat animations were very clean and well animated, which helped the overall smooth feeling of the game. There were flashy crit animations and cool dodge animations like knocking a weapon out of the air with a sword that always felt fun to watch. In fact, the game looks great in general. It's very clean, bright, and visually fun to look at, which was a nice touch, especially since Switch games can often struggle graphically. Map design was similarly fairly strong overall. Elements like villages and recruiting units through talk conversations were welcome returns to the series, albeit ones that weren't used as much as I would have personally liked, and the maps tended to feel varied and interesting as a whole. There were way more standout maps than in Three Houses in particular, which was a game that sometimes felt a little bit flat in the map department. I will admit that a few maps in the later portions of Engage could veer slightly into the Awakening style empty field stuff with enemies, but those maps were mercifully few. The game's maps as a whole remained above average and kept me engaged until the end. A major selling point of the game comes in the ability to use past lords and other major characters in the series in combat through emblem rings. These rings give you powerful abilities, offer skills that can be inherited to your units, and most notably allow you to engage, where your unit temporarily fuses with their selected ring in order to obtain massive boosts. Engaging was always cool, flashy, and super over the top, but the game surprisingly made it work. It always felt really cool to use my Engage at just the right time to turn the tables or beat a particularly tough boss, and seeing all the little references and unique mechanics in each ring was consistently a fun part of the game. Early on, I worried about both the Engage mechanic and the emblem rings being too broken and trivializing the game. However, while the rings were certainly very powerful, I felt like a lot of the game was nicely balanced around them, and often provided adequate challenges that demanded using the rings efficiently. There were points when I felt like the game offered a few too many of the Engage refills, removing the need to manage my Engage meter, but that aside, I never quite felt like the emblems trivialized the game as I worried they would. It helps that many of the more absurd elements of the rings were smartly gated behind the emblem paralogs, and thus were not available until the late sections of the game when the difficulty was ramping up and more firepower was warranted. One element that I absolutely loved is how the game effectively balanced its fan service elements without making them feel like they were taking over the game. When I heard that the game featured cameo characters, and especially when Marth was so prevalent in the early trailers, I was really worried that the game would just be stuffed with cheap fan service. However, I felt like Engage very much had its own identity, while still containing a lot of fun Easter eggs for longtime fans. In particular, the emblem paralogs were absolutely fantastic fan service, bringing back all-star maps that were super fun to revisit. These added a lot of extra meat to the game, and I had fun spotting the little references, like the powerful mages on the Sigurd paralogue that referenced Julius and Ishtar, or chasing down the thief for treasure in Marth's paralogue. It was all just great, and it really rewarded longtime fans of the series. These paralogues also added a lot of genuinely fun playtime to the game, and really rounded things out nicely. The game featured a lot of customization through skill inheritance, allowing players to grab skills from rings. The system was good, but admittedly it was slightly flawed. I did feel like a lot of options were stronger than others. Speed Taker, Kanto, Dual Assist Plus, and a few others really stood out over a lot of other options. Additionally, the SP system was often a bit too restrictive, meaning that it could be really hard to inherit the exact build that you wanted unless you spent a lot of time grinding. Still, I think that it was a mostly solid system that gave the player a number of options in their builds without being too over the top about it. Mostly. I'd like to call attention to new mechanics like the break system, which brings the weapon triangle back in a fun new way. Breaks happen when you land a hit when you have weapon triangle advantage on your enemy, causing them to be unable to attack for one round of combat afterwards, and they work for both your army and the enemies. I found breaking to be a really fun element of the game that rewarded utilizing your team effectively and attacking in a certain order, and it was really satisfying to use it to take down an especially tough enemy or even to bait certain enemies into bad positioning by offering them breaks. Similarly, new elements like chain attacks from appropriate allies and the reworked thief mechanics, which caused stacking, damage increasing poison on hit, were a lot of fun to work with. All of these new mechanics nicely rewarded specific positioning and felt really good to use effectively. I'd imagine that all of these will be even more important once I decide to take on Maddening. When I heard that there was another out-of-battle hub world, I kind of groaned. But thankfully, the Somniel ended up being pretty decent overall. Mercifully, the developers seemed to realize that Three Houses' monastery was way too bloated and tedious. By contrast, Somniel was much less involved, while still offering a few side activities and minigames for those who wanted them. I felt like I was able to choose how much time I was spending outside of battle at any given time, and that was a nice adjustment compared to the seriously overbearing monastery. With that said, there were admittedly a few small areas where I kind of feel like the game could have used some small quality of life touch-ups regarding both Somniel and elsewhere. The biggest issue that I had came in inheriting skills, where I frequently needed to visit the arena to raise bond ranks, then travel 2 screens away to actually inherit the skills. I really feel like these should have been on the same screen to save some time, and when I was doing a lot of inheriting or changing my mind, these little trips back and forth really added up, even when fast traveling. Similarly, I found it really strange that you couldn't buy items in bulk. This was especially notable when buying ingots at the flea market. I'd also call a small bit of attention to the battle UI, which is incredibly misleading at a glance, and which actually got me killed a few times early on in the game. With how the battle forecast displays doubles, it can be easy to miss that you'll be taking a counter hit despite how the data is displayed. I did get used to it, but it's kind of strange that it was something that I had to get used to at all, when it's something that's never really been a problem in most prior titles. These issues and a few others aren't really deal breakers, and they don't hurt my overall perception of the game, but I do hope that they can be fixed through patches later on. Engage's writing has already become a major point of discussion, and it has its fans and its detractors in fairly equal measure. For my part, well, there are some parts that I liked, and several parts that I absolutely did not. I actually think that the first half or so of the plot is pretty decent. Not overtly good, but at least fun. For the first several hours, when you're just traveling around Elios, collecting rings, and meeting all the silly anime characters that you're befriending or fighting, that's pretty fun. At that point, the game really wasn't taking itself seriously, and it was just goofy anime fun, and that much worked for me for sure. Sadly, the game starts taking itself more seriously later in the plot, and that's where the wheels really started to fall off the wagon for me. So here's where I need to pause and give a spoiler warning. I'm going to discuss spoilers for the next few minutes, so if you're worried about those, please skip ahead to the time on the screen. Unfortunately, later in the plot, things start falling to pieces in the worst possible way. Around chapter 19 or so, the story starts taking itself very seriously, and that's when a lot of contrivances and cheesy plot elements start to really drag the plot down. Similarly, a game-long lack of proper development for certain story elements really starts to show itself in the later portions. I tried to hang on to the plot until roughly the point where, as a major twist of the game, it was revealed that Alear is actually a fell dragon instead of a divine dragon. While that is at least a twist, albeit one that I think most people would have seen coming, the fact that the game never really bothered to establish the differences between the two types of dragons made this feel very weightless and honestly just kind of silly. When Alear was on the floor crying about wanting to be a good dragon, I was trying not to burst into laughter, and the game was evidently hoping that I would take the scene very seriously. Another example comes when Alear dies for the first time, and then decides to be revived as a corrupted. At that point, Vale insists that it would be a big deal for Alear to become a corrupted, but as we saw with Hyacinth earlier in the game, Alear would have been fully sentient and aware. The game never really set up any physical differences between the corrupted and others, so the entire drama over this feels completely weightless. It's just one of many examples how the concepts weren't properly developed and the plot suffered for it. And yes, I did say dies for the first time just now. The game really tried to pull off 2 different death scenes for the same character in the span of about an hour, and reversed both of them without any real consequences. Yeesh.
No, that is stupid.
A major focus of the plot, especially in its later stages, is on Vale, a young girl who is both Alear's sibling and a major villain of the game while being mind-controlled by evil magic. Late in the game, she's a huge focus of the plot, both in terms of rescuing her and seeing more of her perspective when she's eventually freed from the magic that makes her evil. It's honestly kind of unfortunate that the plot takes such a heavy swing towards focusing on Vale. While I don't dislike the character, I never really found her to be compelling enough to be such a major focus in the latter portions of the game. When she finally joined the team late in the game, most of her plot had actually been resolved already, so I wasn't really that interested in her formal turn to the good guys. It's actually kind of a shame that Alfred, Diamant, Ivy, and Tamara were all sidelined really hard in later stages of the game, because they were all really fun characters. Unfortunately, they all just kind of get pushed to the side once Vale joins. It's just kind of an area where the game lost me as it reached its later stages. Character motivations were similarly really weak, especially surrounding the villains. The 4 Hounds were major villains of the story that you fought numerous times across the course of the game. Unfortunately, they were all just presented as silly cartoon characters, until it was their turn to die, where they suddenly got a lot of characterization and sad backstory. Sadly, this makes their entire storylines feel really clunky and forced. I actually came to appreciate Marnie, but otherwise, it felt like these characters have these super last-minute tragic turns just to tug on your heartstrings, and it didn't really land for me. When these villains get all of their story through cheap death monologues that last for several minutes just to make you feel bad, it ends up feeling kind of cheap. And, well, then there's Sombron, who, for the vast majority of the game, was a pretty generic evil dragon guy who wanted to conquer worlds or whatever. Then, in the last hour of the game, we suddenly get this storyline about this emblem that he was kind of friends with or something, and I guess he wanted to find it. It felt so completely random and out of nowhere that I was honestly kind of floored. I'm not sure if this storyline is intended to be explored through DLC later, but it just felt completely out of left field and absurd. I guess we're supposed to feel bad for Sombron, but nothing in this plotline is ever developed or set up in any meaningful ways, so that's kind of where I'm at with the entire plot. So much of it feels really underdeveloped, and major plot points often had little to no setup, making it feel like the writers were kind of just making things up as they went along. Look, I know it's beating a dead horse to criticize the game's plot, but when it got bad, it got really bad. So much of it didn't really land, and the wheels came off really hard in the latter half of the game when there wasn't really enough development for these concepts to work like they should. When the story starts to take itself seriously, it just takes a sharp turn towards feeling goofy, and not in the fun and campy way like the earlier plot did. When it comes to character writing, I have a similarly mixed opinion. I feel like fans are pretty split on whether they love or hate the Engage cast, and I find myself kind of in the middle. The game very much suffers from the Fates-esque character writing, where a lot of characters are defined by their gimmicks. There's a character who loves to eat weird foods, a character who loves to work out, and a character who loves alpacas? Okay. However, while these characters are very gimmicky and silly, I didn't outright hate them. A lot of supports did make me laugh at times, and most of the cast is at least pretty likable, even if I didn't exactly love a lot of them. Also, while a lot of supports are pretty shallow, there are some interesting bits of depth buried in a few of the supports, and I appreciated those moments, as rare as they were. Still, I can't deny that these characters felt like a step back after Three Houses. I felt like the Houses cast was super fleshed out, and you really got a sense for their relationships and their lives outside of the war and the school. With Engage, it was honestly pretty hard to imagine these characters existing outside of the events of the game. It's not the worst thing in the world to have these silly, kind of flat characters who are largely likable, but I do kind of wish that they had a little bit more depth to them. As a protagonist, Alear is okay, though they can often fall into some of the same traps as previous Avatar characters. Characters would often worship them, a flaw that we've seen in previous avatars, though I suppose it at least makes some sense this time since Alear is established as an actual deity. Additionally, I felt like their personality was often very safe in order to be a self-insert, something that we previously saw pretty clearly with Chris and Corrin. However, despite these issues, I did feel like Alear at least had a bit more personality than the previous avatars, and they had at least a few supports where they showed a few flaws in some other aspects of their personality. Alear genuinely made me laugh sometimes, which is honestly more than I can say about Chris. I'll probably never love Avatar characters, but Alear was a bit better than average on that front, at least for me. So where does this leave me with Engage as a whole? I had a blast playing it from start to finish, and while the writing is, well, bad, it doesn't exactly change the fact that I loved the game. At the end of the day, Fire Emblem isn't really a series that excels in the writing department anyway, and the gameplay is really the draw of the series for me. And that gameplay worked. It was fun and smooth, and the game was mechanically on point, and honestly the map design felt pretty strong. Look, the game took me almost 70 hours to complete, and I already find myself eager to start up another run and play more. To me, that's the sign of one hell of a game. Yeah, the writing was bad. Really bad. But as an overall Fire Emblem experience, so much of it worked so well that I came out of the entire experience really enjoying it. Despite all of my concerns about the game, it really won me over in the end, and I personally loved it. Nice work, Engage.
Somehow I won.